Imagine this. You're a young Cheyenne woman in 1868, gathering berries near the Washita River when gunshots shatter the morning silence. Within hours, your entire world has collapsed, your family scattered or dead, and you find yourself bound and loaded onto a military wagon, heading toward an uncertain fate that historians have long struggled to document fully. The capture of Native American women during the Indian Wars of the American West created a systematic pattern of trauma that extended far beyond the initial moment of seizure. These women faced a deliberate campaign to strip away their identity, autonomy, and connection to their ancestral ways of life through methods designed to break both body and spirit. From forced labor in military households to systematic sexual exploitation in frontier settlements, these are the harrowing ordeals endured by captured Native women in Wild West America, starting with forced division. Military commanders understood that destroying Native resistance required more than defeating warriors in battle. They recognized that the true strength of tribal societies lay in the intricate web of kinship bonds that held communities together. Women served as the cornerstone of these relationships, maintaining family connections across generations and preserving cultural knowledge through their roles as mothers, sisters, and daughters. Breaking these bonds became a calculated strategy of psychological warfare. The separation process began the moment raids concluded. Officers would immediately identify captured women and children, then systematically divide them based on age and perceived value. Mothers were torn from infants still nursing at their breasts. Sisters who had never spent a day apart found themselves loaded onto different wagons, heading in opposite directions. The military deliberately created chaos and confusion during these separations, using the emotional turmoil to prevent organised resistance or escape attempts. Colonel Nelson Miles implemented this strategy with ruthless efficiency during the winter campaigns of 1878. When his forces surrounded a band of northern Cheyenne attempting to return to their homeland, the aftermath demonstrated the calculated cruelty of forced separation. Among the captives was a woman named White Dove, who watched helplessly as soldiers dragged her 3 children towards separate transport wagons. Her eldest son, barely 14, was classified as a potential warrior and sent to a military prison in Florida. Her 2 daughters disappeared into a system designed to scatter families across vast distances, making reunion nearly impossible. The soldiers showed no mercy for the bonds between mothers and children. White Dove threw herself at the feet of the commanding officer, pleading in broken English and her native tongue for her family to remain together. The officer's response revealed the deliberate nature of these separations. He explained that keeping families intact would only encourage them to maintain their savage ways and plot escapes together. Separation served the dual purpose of preventing coordinated resistance while accelerating the civilization process. Transportation routes were carefully planned to maximize distance and minimize hope. Captured women found themselves loaded onto trains bound for destinations hundreds of miles from their homelands. The journey itself became another tool of separation, as women were often transferred between different facilities during transport, losing track of family members who had initially shared the same fate. Rail stations became scenes of desperate searching as mothers pressed their faces against windows, scanning crowds for glimpses of their children. Fort Robinson in Nebraska became a notorious destination for these separated families. The fort's commanding officers took pride in their efficient processing system, which could separate and classify dozens of captives within hours of their arrival. Women were housed in barracks deliberately positioned far from areas where their male relatives might be detained. Even married couples were forbidden contact, with guards maintaining strict surveillance to prevent any communication that might strengthen family bonds or tribal loyalty. The psychological impact of these separations extended beyond immediate grief. Women who had defined themselves through their relationships to others suddenly found their identities stripped away. Mothers without children, wives without husbands, and daughters without parents experienced a form of social death that preceded any physical suffering they would endure. The military understood that a woman torn from her family connections became more malleable, more likely to accept the cultural transformation demanded of her. Some women attempted desperate measures to maintain contact with their separated family members. They would memorize the uniforms and faces of soldiers who had handled their relatives, hoping to extract information about their whereabouts. Others developed elaborate systems of coded messages, using traditional beadwork patterns or song fragments to communicate their locations to other Native women who might carry word to their families. the separation strategy proved devastatingly effective. Many families scattered during these raids never reunited, even decades later, when some survivors gained freedom to search for their relatives. Children grew up without knowing their mothers' faces, while mothers aged wondering whether their sons and daughters had survived the harsh conditions of captivity. The bonds that had once formed the foundation of tribal society were severed with surgical precision, leaving individuals adrift in an alien world that showed them no mercy. This systematic approach to family destruction represented more than simple cruelty. It reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to break human spirits by targeting the relationships that gave life meaning. The military had learned that a woman fighting for her children possessed dangerous strength, while a woman with nothing left to lose became unpredictable. A woman stripped of all family connections, however, became a blank slate upon which new identities could be imposed through force and repetition. The efficiency of these separation procedures would set the stage for everything that followed. Women entering captivity had already experienced the complete destruction of their social world, making them vulnerable to the additional horrors that awaited them in military facilities and frontier settlements across the American West. Identity erasure. The human soul, military officers believed, resided in the external markers that distinguished one people from another. Strip away the visual symbols of savage identity, and the savage mind would follow. This philosophy drove a systematic campaign to destroy every trace of native identity among captured women, beginning with the most sacred and personal aspects of their appearance and extending into the deepest chambers of their spiritual lives. Hair held profound significance across Plains tribes, representing spiritual power, family lineage, and personal history. Women wore their hair in intricate styles that communicated their clan affiliation, marital status, and spiritual achievements. The length of a woman's hair often indicated her age and wisdom, while specific braiding patterns told stories of her family's honours and losses. Military personnel understood this cultural importance, which made hair the first target in their campaign of cultural destruction. Morning Star, a Cheyenne woman captured during the Sand Creek aftermath, experienced this assault on her identity within hours of her arrival at Fort Lyon. 2 soldiers held her arms, while a third approached with shears that gleamed like weapons in the harsh sunlight. Her hair, which had never been cut and fell nearly to her knees, represented 40 years of spiritual growth and cultural pride. As the blades closed around her braids, Morning Star felt something deeper than physical pain. Each severed strand carried away a piece of her connection to her ancestors, her tribe, and her understanding of herself. The soldiers showed no reverence for what they destroyed. Her beautiful black hair, woven with sacred beads and eagle feathers that had taken years to earn, fell to the ground like discarded rope. The men swept it into piles with their boots, mixing it with dirt and debris, as if it were nothing more than animal fur. Morning Star watched her identity disappear into the dust, while the soldiers laughed about her transformation, from squaw to almost human. Language became the next battlefield in this war against native identity. Women who spoke their tribal languages faced immediate and severe punishment, often involving prolonged isolation or physical abuse that left lasting scars. The goal extended beyond simple communication control. Military authorities understood that language carried the deepest aspects of cultural knowledge, including spiritual beliefs, traditional stories, and tribal history that passed from mother to daughter across generations. Redwing, an Arapaho woman seized during a winter raid, discovered the brutal enforcement of English-only policies during her first week at a Colorado territorial facility. When she instinctively called out to another captive in her native tongue, guards immediately dragged both women to isolation cells barely large enough for a single person to lie down. They remained in these boxes for 3 days without food, emerging only when they demonstrated their willingness to communicate exclusively in broken English phrases they had been forced to memorize. The attack on traditional clothing completed the visual transformation from native woman to anonymous captive. Elaborately decorated dresses that told stories of family history and personal achievements were burned in ceremonial fires while their owners watched helplessly. These garments represented months or years of careful work, with each bead and quill work pattern carrying specific meaning within tribal culture. Replacing them with rough military surplus clothing served both practical and psychological purposes, erasing individual identity while marking the women as property of the United States government. Spiritual practices faced the most systematic destruction, as military authorities recognized that native religious beliefs provided strength and hope that made captives difficult to control. Women who attempted to perform traditional prayers or ceremonies faced punishments that often exceeded those given to male warriors for violent resistance. The suppression of female spiritual leadership proved particularly devastating, as women held crucial roles in many tribal religious traditions. White Buffalo Woman, a Lakota spiritual leader captured after the Little Bighorn Campaign, witnessed the complete destruction of her sacred possessions during her first day of captivity. Her medicine bundle, containing items blessed by generations of holy women, was dumped onto the ground and examined by soldiers who handled sacred objects with the casual disrespect they might show to kitchen utensils. When she protested their desecration of holy items, guards forced her to watch as they burned everything that had connected her to the spiritual world of her people. The renaming process provided the final stroke in this campaign of identity destruction. Military clerks assigned European names to captive women with the same casual efficiency they might use to inventory supplies. These new names carried no connection to family history, personal achievements, or spiritual significance. Morning Star became Mary, Red Wing became Susan, White Buffalo Woman became Catherine. The sacred names their families had given them, often received through vision quests or ceremonial recognition, disappeared from official records as if they had never existed. Some women attempted to preserve fragments of their true selves through secret acts of cultural retention. They would trace traditional patterns in the dirt when guards were not watching, or hum sacred songs so quietly that only they could hear the melodies. Others developed elaborate memory systems to preserve stories and spiritual knowledge they hoped to pass on if they ever regained freedom. These efforts at cultural preservation required extraordinary courage, as discovery meant severe punishment that could include extended isolation, reduced food rations, or physical abuse that left permanent damage. Yet many women chose to risk everything rather than allow their identities to disappear completely into the void that military authorities had created for them. Unpaid servitude, the transformation of captured native women into an exploitable labour force, represented one of the most calculated aspects of the military's civilization campaign. Officers and frontier families discovered that these women possessed valuable skills in textile work, food preparation, and domestic management that could be extracted without compensation under the guise of cultural education. What authorities presented as benevolent training in civilized living became a system of slavery that enriched white households while grinding down the spirits of women already stripped of everything they had once called their own. Military wives at frontier posts quickly recognized the economic opportunity that captive women represented. These officers' families had struggled with the harsh realities of frontier domestic life, where finding reliable household help proved nearly impossible and expensive. Domestic servants remained beyond the reach of most military salaries. Captured native women solved this problem perfectly, providing skilled labour that cost nothing beyond minimal food and shelter, while offering the additional benefit of appearing philanthropic to outside observers. Colonel Harrison's wife at Fort Laramie exemplified this exploitation when she selected 3 Arapaho women from a group of recent captives. She justified her choices by explaining to visiting dignitaries that she was providing these unfortunate savages with valuable training in proper household management. The reality proved far different from her charitable rhetoric. The 3 women, who had managed complex households within their own tribal communities for decades, found themselves working 18-hour days in conditions that would have sparked outrage if applied to any white domestic servant. Swift Current, one of the selected women, had previously managed a household of 15 family members across 3 generations, coordinating food storage, hide preparation, and seasonal migrations with expertise developed over 30 years of experience. At Fort Laramie, she found herself scrubbing floors on her hands and knees, while Mrs. Harrison criticised her technique and demanded she redo work that had already been completed to military standards. The irony of receiving domestic training from a woman who had never tanned a hide or preserved meat for winter survival was not lost on Swift Current, though expressing such thoughts would have brought swift punishment. The laundry operations at military posts became particularly notorious for their brutal exploitation of captive women. These facilities processed uniforms and bedding for hundreds of soldiers, requiring endless hours of back-breaking labour over steaming wash tubs and caustic soap solutions that ate away at the skin of women forced to work without proper protective equipment. The military presented this work as vocational training that would prepare native women for productive lives in civilized society. But the reality involved industrial-scale domestic labour that generated substantial profits for post commanders who charged soldiers for laundry services. Morning Rain, a Cheyenne woman who had once been renowned among her people for creating beautiful beadwork and decorated clothing, found herself assigned to the Fort Robinson laundry facility, where her artistic hands were destroyed by lye soap and scalding water. She worked from dawn until well past sunset, processing loads of soiled military uniforms while standing in pools of dirty water that soaked through her inadequate shoes. When chemical burns began eating through the skin of her hands, she received no medical treatment, only warnings that complaining about her conditions would result in reduced food rations. The most insidious aspect of this labour exploitation involved the appropriation of traditional native crafts for commercial sale. Military authorities discovered that captured women possessed skills in beadwork, pottery, and textile creation that commanded high prices among Eastern collectors fascinated by authentic Indian artifacts. These women found themselves forced to create traditional items that were then sold in markets across the country, with all profits flowing to their captors, while the creators received nothing beyond their basic survival needs. Singing Bird, a Lakota woman famous among her people for quill work that told complex spiritual stories, was forced to produce simplified versions of sacred designs for sale to tourists and collectors. She watched military personnel sell items that had taken her weeks to complete, knowing that the money earned from her labour would never benefit her or contribute to any hope of eventually gaining freedom. The spiritual significance of the design she created had been stripped away, reducing sacred symbols to mere decorative objects that adorned the homes of people who had no understanding of their original meaning. The educational programs established at various facilities served primarily as cover for this labour exploitation. Captive women were enrolled in domestic science courses that consisted entirely of performing household labour for their captors, while receiving lectures about the superiority of white domestic practices. These programs produced detailed records that documented the civilizing progress being made, but the actual education involved nothing more than forced labour disguised as cultural improvement. Kitchen assignments became another form of exploitative training, where native women worked as unpaid cooks while supposedly learning proper food preparation techniques. Many of these women had fed their families for decades, using sophisticated preservation and cooking methods adapted to nomadic lifestyles. Yet they found themselves treated as ignorant beginners who needed instruction in basic nutrition and meal planning from military cooks whose own skills paled in comparison to traditional native food management systems. The physical toll of this unpaid labour proved devastating to women already weakened by the trauma of capture and cultural destruction. Their bodies broke down under the relentless demands of industrial-scale, domestic work performed without adequate nutrition or rest. Yet military authorities pointed to their participation in these labour programmes as evidence of successful assimilation, creating records that portrayed exploitation as education and slavery as salvation for women whose only crime had been belonging to tribes that stood in the way of American expansion. Sanctioned abuse. The complete vulnerability of captive native women created opportunities for sexual exploitation that military and civilian authorities not only permitted, but actively facilitated through systems that stripped these women of any protection or recourse. Their status as enemy combatants' property, combined with racial ideologies that portrayed native women as inherently promiscuous, created an environment where sexual violence became routine and invisible. The absence of any meaningful oversight or accountability transformed military posts and frontier settlements into hunting grounds where predators operated with impunity. Military commanders understood that sexual access to captive women served as both a reward for their personnel and a weapon of psychological warfare against tribal communities. The systematic rape of captured women sent a clear message about the complete powerlessness of native peoples to protect their most vulnerable members. This violence extended beyond individual acts of brutality to become an institutionalized practice that commanders tolerated and sometimes encouraged as a means of maintaining morale among troops stationed in harsh frontier conditions. Lieutenant Morrison, at Fort Kearny, exemplified the predatory behaviour that flourished within this system when he selected a young Pawnee woman named Bright Star from a group of recent captives. He justified his choice by claiming she would serve as his personal interpreter. Though she spoke no English and he had no knowledge of her language, Morrison installed Bright Star in quarters adjacent to his own rooms, where she remained available for his use while being listed in official records as a domestic servant receiving vocational training. Bright Star had been captured during a raid that killed her husband and scattered her 3 young children to unknown fates. Her grief and desperation made resistance seem pointless, particularly when Morrison made clear that her cooperation might influence whether she would ever receive information about her missing family. The lieutenant used her maternal anguish as leverage, promising news of her children in exchange for sexual compliance, while never intending to honour such agreements. The isolation of frontier posts created perfect conditions for systematic sexual exploitation, as captive women had no access to outside authorities or advocates who might intervene on their behalf. Guards and officers operated within a closed system where their word carried absolute authority over women who could not speak English, had no understanding of military procedures, and possessed no legal status that might protect them from abuse. Sarah Winnemucca, one of the few Native women who later gained the ability to document these experiences, witnessed the systematic sexual assault of captive women during her time at various military installations. She observed how officers selected the youngest and most attractive captives for personal use, often maintaining multiple women simultaneously, while official records listed them as servants or students in cultural education programs. Winnemucca's testimony revealed a network of sexual exploitation that extended from commanding officers down to enlisted men, with each level of the military hierarchy claiming its privileges over defenseless women. The practice of forced marriage represented another form of sexual violence disguised as benevolent assimilation policy. Military authorities arranged marriages between captive Native women and white settlers, presenting these unions as opportunities for cultural advancement while ignoring the complete absence of consent from the women involved. These marriages served multiple purposes for colonial authorities, providing wives for frontier men who struggled to find willing partners while advancing the goal of diluting tribal bloodlines through intermarriage. Little Fox, a Cheyenne woman captured after her village was destroyed, found herself selected for marriage to a homesteader named Thomas Bradley, who had requested a native wife through informal arrangements with military personnel. Bradley had lost his previous wife to disease and needed someone to manage his household and help with farm labour. Military authorities presented this arrangement as a generous opportunity for Little Fox to gain protection and social standing, while Bradley received an unpaid domestic worker and sexual partner whose legal status provided him with complete control over her life. The marriage ceremony occurred without Little Fox's consent or understanding, conducted in English by a military chaplain who made no effort to explain the proceedings to her. Bradley's remote homestead became her prison, where she endured sexual assault, physical violence and forced labour, while being completely cut off from any possibility of escape or rescue. The legal framework of marriage provided Bradley with absolute authority over his native wife, including the right to punish her through violence if she resisted his demands. Breeding programs represented the most calculated form of sexual exploitation, designed to produce mixed-race children who would bridge the gap between white and native communities while weakening tribal genetic lines. Military authorities encouraged sexual relationships between white personnel and captive women, viewing the resulting children as living proof of successful assimilation, while creating a class of mixed-race individuals who would serve as intermediaries between cultures. These programs operated under the pseudo-scientific belief that native characteristics could be bred out of future generations through systematic intermarriage with whites. Captive women became unwilling participants in genetic experiments that treated their bodies as breeding stock, while their children faced uncertain futures straddling two worlds that often rejected them completely. The silence surrounding these sexual crimes reflected the complete powerlessness of Native women within military and frontier social systems. They could not file complaints, seek legal redress, or appeal to outside authorities for protection. Their testimony carried no weight against the word of white men, while language barriers prevented them from communicating their experiences even to sympathetic listeners. This enforced silence allowed sexual predators to operate without fear of consequences, creating a culture of violence that traumatized generations of Native women, whose suffering remained hidden from historical records. Lasting consequences. The trauma inflicted upon captured Native women rippled through generations like stones cast into still water, creating waves of destruction that reached far beyond the original victims into the lives of children, grandchildren, and entire tribal communities struggling to reconstruct their shattered social fabric. The systematic separation of mothers from their offspring created a lost generation of Native children who grew up disconnected from their cultural roots, while the women who survived captivity often found themselves unable to bridge the gap between their traumatic experiences and the communities they hoped to rejoin. Children born during captivity occupied a particularly tragic position within this generational catastrophe, belonging fully to neither the white world that had enslaved their mothers nor the tribal communities that viewed them with suspicion and uncertainty. These mixed-race offspring carried the visible evidence of their mother's suffering, while facing rejection from both sides of their heritage, creating a class of individuals who would struggle throughout their lives to find acceptance and identity in a world that had no place for them. The systematic adoption of Native children into white families represented one of the most devastating aspects of this generational destruction. Military authorities viewed these adoptions as humanitarian gestures that would provide savage children with opportunities for civilized upbringing, but the reality involved the permanent severing of family bonds that had already been stretched to breaking points. Children were given new names, forbidden from speaking their native languages, and raised with no knowledge of their biological families or tribal heritage. Mary Crow Feather spent 15 years searching for her daughter after their separation during a raid on their Lakota camp in 1876. When she finally located the child, now called Elizabeth Manning, and living with a Methodist minister's family in Kansas, the reunion revealed the full extent of the cultural destruction that had occurred. The girl, now 13 years old, spoke no Lakota and showed visible fear when her biological mother attempted to embrace her. Elizabeth had been raised to view Indians as dangerous savages, creating the horrific irony of a native child who had been conditioned to fear and despise her own mother. The psychological conditioning that Elizabeth had undergone proved nearly impossible to reverse. Her adoptive family had filled her mind with stories about savage Indians who killed innocent children, never revealing that she herself was one of those children they claimed to have rescued. When Mary Crow Feather attempted to teach her daughter traditional songs and stories, Elizabeth recoiled in terror, begging to return to the only family she could remember. The reunion that Mary had dreamed about for over a decade became a source of mutual anguish that highlighted the irreversible nature of cultural destruction. Women who survived captivity and eventually gained freedom faced the equally challenging task of reintegrating into tribal communities that had continued evolving during their absence. These survivors carried psychological scars that manifested in ways their families and friends could not understand, while the experiences they had endured often seemed too horrific for their communities to fully comprehend or acknowledge. Standing Bear Woman returned to her Cheyenne community after 6 years of captivity, but the woman who came home bore little resemblance to the vibrant young mother who had been taken during a cavalry raid. The forced labour, sexual violence, and cultural destruction she had endured left her unable to participate in traditional ceremonies or maintain the social relationships that had once defined her identity. She would sit silently during community gatherings, her eyes holding a haunted quality that made others uncomfortable and uncertain about how to help her heal. Her inability to discuss her experiences created a barrier between Standing Bear Woman and her surviving relatives, who desperately wanted to understand what she had endured but lacked the emotional tools to process such traumatic revelations. The silence that surrounded her captivity became another form of isolation, as she found herself carrying the weight of her experiences alone, while her community struggled to provide support for trauma they could barely comprehend. The children who had been born in captivity and later rejoined tribal communities faced unique challenges that reflected the complex nature of their mixed heritage and traumatic origins. These individuals often possessed valuable skills in English language and white cultural practices that could benefit their tribes, but they also carried the psychological burden of their mother's suffering and their own uncertain identity within traditional native social structures. Fort Berthold Reservation became home to dozens of these survivors and their children during the 1890s, creating a community of individuals bound together by shared trauma and cultural displacement. The reservation's records documented the complex process of family reconstruction as survivors attempted to rebuild relationships that had been shattered by years of forced separation. Mothers searched for children who had grown up without them, while siblings worked to recognize each other across the gulf created by different captivity experiences. The tribal elders at Fort Berthold recognized that traditional healing ceremonies would need to be adapted to address forms of trauma that their ancestors had never encountered. They developed new rituals that honored the suffering of captive women while providing pathways for reintegration into community life. These ceremonies acknowledged that some wounds might never fully heal, while affirming the survivors' continued place within tribal identity. Modern tribal historians have worked to document these experiences through oral history projects that finally give voice to the suffering that was deliberately hidden from historical records. These efforts represent attempts to honor the memory of women who endured unimaginable trauma while preserving their stories for future generations, who need to understand the full scope of historical injustice inflicted upon Native communities. The legacy of captured Native women extends beyond individual suffering to encompass the systematic destruction of cultural knowledge that died with them, the children who never learned their heritage, and the communities that lost the wisdom and strength these women would have contributed to tribal survival and adaptation.